Call on members' order of the day number 3.
Overseas Investment Protection of New Zealand Homebuyers Amendment Bill, first reading.
No, you call first.
Oh, Mr. Speaker.
Phil Twyford.
I move that the Overseas Investment Protection of New Zealand Homebuyers Amendment Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Government Administration Committee to consider the bill. Mr. Speaker, I want to start by addressing the problem that this bill is designed to fix. And I want to draw the House's attention to a story that has been running on the New Zealand Herald website today about a house flip in the Auckland suburb of Beach Haven, in which the house jumped $180,000 in price in just 2 months. The Barfoot and Thompson agent who sold the house said it went over the phone to a buyer last Thursday. The house is empty, he's told the Herald. It was telephone bidding. There's been nothing done to the house in between sales. This is happening all of the time around here. A neighbour, I think, who spoke to the Herald said Auckland has become a speculator's paradise when a Beach Haven house sells for $180,000 more in just 2.5 months. Mr. Speaker, this bill amends the Overseas Investment Act 2005. It applies new restrictions on non-resident purchases of New Zealand residential property in order to protect New Zealand home buyers. We've seen in this country a housing crisis, the results of which have been all over the TV screens, the radio and the newspapers now for several years, but particularly it seems to have worked itself up into a crescendo over the last few days and weeks. At the heart of that problem are a number of drivers that have seen Auckland house prices become amongst the most unaffordable in the world relative to incomes. Labor believes that out-of-control property speculation is one of those key drivers. Under the provisions of this bill, non-residents will be granted permission to purchase a residential property only if they intend to live here permanently or their purchase adds to the existing stock of housing. So, for example, a non-resident wishing to purchase vacant land with a commitment to begin building a dwelling within 12 months is likely to have their application granted. Students, skilled migrants and other persons who are temporarily resident in New Zealand will be granted approval to purchase a house on the condition that it is sold if they subsequently leave the country. Any non-resident person found to have purchased a residential property without the approval of the Overseas Investment Office could be forced to sell the property, which may cause them a loss and they may have to wear a fine. Mr. Speaker, this has been one of the most intensely debated and discussed issues in relation to New Zealand's housing crisis. This bill reflects the Labour Party's policy to ban non-resident foreigners from buying existing homes and say to them, if you're a non-resident foreigner, you live on the other side of the world and you want to buy a house in New Zealand, build a new one. That's the Australian policy, and it's been working successfully there because in the last 12 months, it has channeled nearly $30 billion of foreign direct investment into the building of new homes. This policy, Mr. Speaker, is supported by an overwhelming majority of New Zealanders. The last 3 News Read research poll on this found that 61% of New Zealanders support this policy, including a majority of National Party voters. 54% of National Party voters in that poll of 1,000 people said that they supported the ban, which is Labour's policy. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is common knowledge. Everybody knows in Auckland that non-resident foreign speculators are bidding up the price of housing, just as it was reported in the New Zealand Herald today that a phone bidder from offshore snapped up that house at $180,000 more than it was sold for only 2 months before. Some very disturbing data came out recently that showed that speculators, foreign and domestic, are hoovering up the more affordable suburbs in Auckland. In the last 12 months, 80% of property transactions in the South Auckland suburb of Otara were made by investors. or speculators, depending on which way you want to describe them. So, and it should be no surprise to this House that it is the suburb of Otara that has that very high level of speculator activity that has the most rapidly falling level of home ownership. More than 4 times the national average. That is the reality in John Key's New Zealand today. That is the consequence of the housing crisis that this national government has allowed to spiral out of control. And right across Auckland now, particularly in the more affordable suburbs in South and West Auckland, entire streets of homes are owned by absentee foreign landlords who are never seen in that neighbourhood. They are never seen. And this is destroying communities and neighbourhoods right across our country's largest city. John Key has painted himself into a corner on this policy, and the proof of this was seen recently when we saw the national government selectively and manipulatively releasing data that had been gathered over the last 6 months by Land Information New Zealand. And poor old Louise Upston was left with the job of having to release this shonky data, and the government tried to claim that the data showed that there were only that foreign buyers only amounted to 3% of the buyers in the market. And nothing could be that. If Stephen Joyce's maths are so bad that he's willing to interject in this House to say that data suggested that only 3%, then economic development in this country is in very, very bad hands. Because even the most cursory analysis of that land information data showed that up to 48% of the transactions could have been offshore buyers. Because 45%...
I'm going to ask the member to sit, and I'm going to ask Dr. Coleman to stand, withdraw and apologise.
Apologise.
Phil Twyford.
Because 45% of the transactions in that land information data had been excluded from the final calculation of the presence of foreign buyers. 45% of the transactions were excluded, including trusts, businesses, companies, people on student visas, people on temporary work visas. The data was shot through with holes. It has no credibility at all. The only thing that data shows is that this government was so desperate to try to support a political point that foreign buyers were not a significant presence in the Auckland market, that they were prepared to embarrass themselves by releasing such selective and manipulative data in such a cynical and dishonest way. One of the things that really upsets people...
Now the member will stand, withdraw. He cannot accuse ministers of being dishonest.
I stand, withdraw and apologise.
And apologise, thank you.
Yeah. I meant to say that the release of the data was cynical. I certainly didn't mean to say it was dishonest. The thing that really upsets people in Auckland is that there are an estimated 15,000 ghost houses in Auckland that are sitting empty. The census data identified 22,000. When you do the calculations, you remove the ones that are in between tenancies or in the process of being sold. There are approximately 15,000 properties deliberately left empty by their absentee landlords who are happy to make 25% a year capital gain, as they did last year, can't be bothered renting the house out to tenants. This is one of the symbols of the National Party's housing crisis. And, sir, it's got to change. It's got to stop. And Labor says that there is no benefit to New Zealand or New Zealanders in allowing non-resident foreigners to sit on the other side of the world and bid up the price of housing, disenfranchising young Kiwi first home buyers in the process. And it was the Prime Minister who said that he didn't want New Zealanders to be tenants in their own land. Well, that is exactly what's happening, because home ownership rates are falling so rapidly. There are now, in Auckland, a majority of people are renters. A majority are renters. We have the lowest home ownership rates in 64 years, thanks to the negligent housing policies of this national government. I want to point out, sir, that a number of commentators, the BNZ Chief Economist Tony Alexander, said there's merit in this bill, noting that we are becoming one of the few residential markets left around the world that is completely open to foreign buyers. The New Zealand economist and investment broker Rodney Jones, based in Beijing, has supported action like this bill by saying, look, the foreign buyers go to New Zealand or Australia or Canada, they can buy freehold property that's theirs forever. That's a very powerful allure, and that's not going to go away. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is not a silver bullet, but it will make a major contribution to fixing the housing crisis.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
E te mana